December 15, 1944. The Ardennes forest stretched endlessly before the eyes of Private James Washington, a thin blanket of snow covering the frozen ground beneath his boots. The 23-year-old supply clerk from Georgia had never imagined he would be here, shivering in the Belgian wilderness, separated from his unit during what would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge. His commanders had written him off hours ago, another casualty statistic in a conflict that consumed men with industrial efficiency. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What no one could have predicted was that this young man, dismissed and underestimated his entire military career, would emerge from those dark woods leading 30 captured soldiers from the opposing army, forever changing how courage and capability were measured in a segregated military that had never wanted him in the first place. Private Washington had enlisted in June 1943, driven by a complex mixture of patriotism, economic necessity, and a burning desire to prove himself in a nation that still viewed men like him through the distorted lens of segregation. He was assigned to the 677th Transportation Company, one of the many units designated specifically for African American soldiers, where most of his duties involved loading trucks, managing supply inventories, and performing the thankless logistical tasks that kept armies moving, but earned no glory or recognition. His commanding officer, Captain Robert Hendricks, a career military man from Virginia with deeply ingrained prejudices, made no secret of his low expectations for his colored troops, as he called them without apparent awareness of the term's condescension. During training exercises at Fort Huachaca in Arizona, Hendricks had repeatedly stated, often within earshot of the men he commanded, that supply personnel should stick to their assigned tasks and leave combat operations to those better suited for it, by which he meant white infantry soldiers. Washington heard these comments, absorbed them alongside the 1,000 other small humiliations that defined military service for African American soldiers, and continued performing his duties with quiet excellence that went largely unnoticed. He loaded trucks faster than anyone else in his unit, mastered the complex logistics of supply chain management, and scored expert marksman during rifle qualification, a fact that earned him momentary praise, followed by the dismissive observation that shooting targets on a range bore no relationship to actual combat capability. The assignment to support operations in Europe came in September 1944, part of the massive logistical build-up following the successful landings in Normandy. Washington found himself in the port city of Antwerp, Belgium, processing supply shipments destined for advancing Allied forces that were pushing toward the borders of the nation they fought against. The work was monotonous, but essential in ways that military planners understood, even if combat soldiers did not. Thousands of tons of ammunition, food rations, medical supplies, winter clothing, replacement parts, and countless other items passed through their hands daily. Washington worked alongside his fellow soldiers, men like Corporal David Thompson from Detroit, who had been a factory worker before the conflict, and Private First Class Marcus Johnson from Philadelphia, who had taught elementary school and spoke with the careful diction of an educated man, constantly aware that his words would be judged more harshly than those of white soldiers with less education. They were all aware that their contributions, though vital to military operations, would never earn them the same recognition as combat infantrymen, and certainly not the recognition afforded to white support personnel who performed identical tasks. The military's segregation policies extended beyond unit assignments into every aspect of service life. Separate barracks, separate mess facilities, separate recreation areas, and an entire parallel structure that constantly reminded them of their officially designated inferiority. Yet they persisted, found dignity in their work, supported each other through the combination of pride and frustration that characterized their service, and maintained hope that their contributions might eventually be recognized, if not during the conflict, then perhaps afterward, when the nation they were fighting for might finally extend to them the equality it claimed to defend abroad. The winter of 1944 arrived with brutal force that caught Allied commanders by surprise. Temperatures plummeted to well below freezing, and snow began accumulating across the region in quantities that transformed the landscape and paralyzed military operations not adequately prepared for such conditions. Intelligence reports, filtered through the optimistic lens of commanders eager to believe their own success narratives, suggested that the opposing forces were depleted, their supply lines stretched impossibly thin, their industrial capacity crippled by sustained bombing campaigns, their ability to mount any significant offensive operation severely compromised by cumulative losses that could not be replaced. The prevailing wisdom among Allied commanders was that the conflict in Western Europe would be concluded by spring, perhaps even by the end of winter, that resistance would collapse once forces crossed into the territory they opposed, that final victory was simply a matter of maintaining momentum and adequate supply flow. This assessment, which would prove catastrophically wrong within days, shaped the distribution of forces and resources throughout the region. Experienced units were pulled back for rest and refitting. The Ardennes sector, considered quiet and unlikely to see significant action, was held by a thin line of troops, many of them newly arrived replacements or, like Washington's transportation company, support units not trained or equipped for sustained combat operations. The forest itself, that vast expanse of hills and dense woodland that straddled the Belgian-German border, was considered a natural barrier that would channel any potential offensive into more easily defended sectors to the north or south. On December 12th, Washington's unit received orders to deliver emergency winter supplies to forward positions near the town of Sankt Vith, not far from the Belgian-German border. The convoy consisted of 8 trucks loaded with blankets, heavy coats, insulated boots, medical kits, field rations, and other materials needed to sustain soldiers operating in the increasingly harsh winter conditions. Captain Hendricks assigned the mission reluctantly, noting in his log that the route passed uncomfortably close to areas where scout patrols had reported possible enemy activity, though nothing substantial enough to warrant serious concern or justify altering the supply schedule that higher command expected to be maintained with mechanical precision regardless of tactical considerations. Washington volunteered to serve as a driver's assistant for Sergeant William Crawford, a white NCO from Tennessee who had been assigned to the 677th as a liaison and supervisor. Part of the military's policy of ensuring white authority remained present even in segregated units. Crawford treated Washington with distant but not hostile professionalism, a relationship that existed in the complicated space between the overt prejudice of some white soldiers and the genuine camaraderie that occasionally developed between men who worked closely together, regardless of official segregation policies. Crawford was a practical man, focused on completing missions efficiently, and he had learned that Washington was reliable, competent, and required minimal supervision, qualities he valued more than any abstract considerations of racial hierarchy. They departed before dawn on December 13th, the trucks rumbling through narrow forest roads that wound between snow-laden pine trees. Crawford sat behind the wheel, his breath visible in the frigid air despite the truck's inadequate heating system, while Washington navigated using a detailed military map that marked their route through the Ardennes with the precise lines and annotations that suggested a confidence about control of territory that reality did not support. The forest seemed peaceful in the early morning darkness, almost serene with only the sound of diesel engines and the crunch of snow under heavy tires breaking the silence. Crawford spoke occasionally about his wife back home, about the farm he planned to buy after discharge, about simple dreams of a future beyond military service, dreams that he shared without apparent awareness that Washington might have similar hopes but faced far greater obstacles to achieving them, in a nation that systematically limited opportunities for men who looked like him. 17 miles from their destination, everything changed in the space of seconds that would be seared into Washington's memory forever. The lead truck rounded a bend in the forest road and erupted in flames, struck by an anti-tank projectile that tore through its front section with devastating force. The explosion echoed through the trees, a sharp crack followed by the deeper roar of fuel igniting, sending fragments of metal spinning through the air like deadly confetti. Crawford slammed the brakes instinctively, and Washington felt the truck skid on ice before coming to a jarring halt that threw him forward against the dashboard. Soldiers from the opposing army emerged from concealed positions along both sides of the road, their winter camouflage blending perfectly with the surrounding forest. their movements coordinated and practiced, their weapons already firing before the echo of the initial explosion had faded. What Washington witnessed in those next moments would be seared into his memory forever, with the hyper-clarity that trauma creates. The attack was coordinated and overwhelming, executed with the precision of soldiers who had planned this ambush carefully and chosen their ground well. Soldiers armed with rifles and machine guns poured fire into the convoy from multiple directions, creating a crossfire that left no safe zone along the road. Crawford threw open his door and shouted for everyone to scatter into the forest, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of weapons fire and shouting men. Washington grabbed his rifle, a standard-issue M1 Garand that he had fired countless times on the range but never in actual confrontation, never with the knowledge that failure to use it effectively might mean his immediate death. He dove into the snow-covered underbrush just as bullets began stitching patterns across the truck's metal frame, the distinctive ping of rounds striking steel, mixing with the deeper thuds of impacts into wood and earth. The forest swallowed him, its dense undergrowth and accumulating snow providing cover that was psychological as much as physical. Washington crawled through deep snow, his uniform soaking through immediately, the cold penetrating with shocking intensity, his breath coming in ragged gasps that formed clouds in the freezing air. He could hear others crashing through the brush nearby, both Allied soldiers trying to escape and opposing forces pursuing them with the efficiency of hunters who knew this terrain intimately. A voice shouted in German, close enough that Washington froze, pressing himself against the base of a large pine tree, his heart hammering so hard he was convinced it would give away his position. The voice called again, then moved away, the sounds of pursuit fading as whoever had been searching apparently concluded their quarry had gone in a different direction. Minutes passed like hours, while Washington remained motionless, too terrified to move, too cold to remain still indefinitely. The sounds of combat gradually faded, replaced by the whisper of wind through branches and the occasional crack of a distant weapon. Washington waited until the forest fell silent before daring to move again, each motion careful and deliberate, painfully aware that any sound might draw attention he could not afford. He had no idea where his unit was, no way to determine which direction led to safety and which led deeper into territory controlled by the opposing forces. His map was back in the truck, probably destroyed in the attack or already in enemy hands. All he had was his rifle, 2 8-round clips of ammunition totaling 16 rounds, a canteen half filled with water that was already beginning to freeze, and a compass that had been in his jacket pocket, standard-issue equipment that suddenly represented the difference between having a plan and being completely lost. The temperature continued to drop as afternoon gave way to evening, that subtle but relentless decline that turned discomfort into genuine danger. Washington moved carefully through the forest, trying to stay oriented using his compass, heading west where he hoped to encounter Allied lines, or at minimum move away from the ambush site and the concentrations of opposing forces that had executed it. His boots were designed for supply depot work, not winter wilderness survival, and he could feel the cold penetrating through the leather with each step, feel his toes beginning to go numb despite wool socks that were now soaked through. He knew that exposure was as deadly as any enemy soldier, that hypothermia killed with the same finality as bullets, that he needed to find shelter before nightfall or risk never seeing another dawn. As darkness descended with the abruptness of winter in northern latitudes, Washington discovered a small depression in the ground where several fallen trees had created a natural windbreak. He cleared snow from the space beneath the logs, using his hands because he dared not use any tools that might make noise, and huddled there, wrapping his arms around himself for warmth that would not come. The temperature that night dropped to 15 degrees below freezing, according to weather records preserved in military archives. Washington forced himself to stay awake, knowing that falling asleep could mean never waking up, that hypothermia's final stage brought a dangerous drowsiness that mimicked comfortable rest while actually marking the transition toward death. He thought about his mother in Savannah, a woman who had cleaned white people's homes her entire life to provide for her son, who had been so proud when he enlisted, despite her fear that military service might take him from her forever. He thought about the letters he had written describing mundane details of military life, carefully avoiding any mention of danger or difficulty, because he knew she worried enough without additional cause. He thought about Captain Hendricks, who had probably already marked him as missing and presumed lost, another casualty number in reports that would be filed, with bureaucratic efficiency and minimal emotion. Dawn on December 14th arrived with weak grey light filtering through the forest canopy, that pale illumination that provided visibility without warmth. Washington's joints were stiff, his muscles cramped from hours of shivering, his clothing frozen in places where moisture had accumulated and then crystallized. He forced himself to move, knowing that staying still was surrender, that he had not survived the night only to give up with morning. He continued west, occasionally hearing the distant rumble of artillery or the drone of aircraft overhead, sounds that confirmed combat operations continued but provided no useful information about which direction actually led to safety. The forest seemed endless, an unbroken expanse of snow and trees that concealed both sanctuary and danger, that offered no landmarks or features that might help orient someone without detailed maps or knowledge of the terrain. Around midday, guided by nothing more than desperate hope and the compass heading he had maintained since escaping the ambush, Washington heard voices. He dropped into a crouch instinctively, moving slowly toward the sound with the hunting skills his grandfather had taught him in Georgia pine forests, skills that white officers had dismissed as irrelevant to military service. Through the trees, using branches and undergrowth for concealment, he spotted a small clearing where 5 soldiers from the opposing army had established a temporary position. They were young, perhaps even younger than Washington's 23 years, their faces hollow with exhaustion and cold, their uniforms showing the wear of extended operations without adequate support or resupply. They spoke quietly in German, their voices carrying a tone of resignation rather than aggression, the sound of men who were cold, hungry, lost, and profoundly aware that the grand offensive they had been thrown into was not unfolding as their commanders had promised. Washington watched them for several minutes, noting their positions, their equipment, the way they seemed more focused on a small fire they were attempting to start than maintaining combat readiness or security. One of them had removed his boots and was examining his feet, a clear sign of frostbite concerns that made sense given the brutal conditions and what Washington suspected was inadequate winter gear. Another was attempting to open a can of something using a bayonet, his movements clumsy with cold or hunger, or both. They looked defeated, demoralized, more concerned with immediate survival than military objectives, and Washington recognized in their condition a reflection of his own desperate circumstances. He could have retreated, could have continued his journey westward, and avoided any encounter that might go badly in ways he could barely imagine. But something in their demeanor sparked an idea that seemed simultaneously brilliant and insane, the kind of desperate gambit that only makes sense when all conventional options have been exhausted. These soldiers looked defeated, broken, ready to accept almost any alternative to continued suffering in these woods. The opposing army's winter offensive, which would eventually be recognized as a desperate last attempt to change the conflict's momentum, had thrown poorly supplied units into brutal conditions with promises of quick victory and glory that had evaporated in the reality of Allied resistance and the unforgiving weather. Intelligence estimates, compiled from prisoner interrogations conducted in the weeks following the offensive's collapse, would reveal that many of these soldiers were operating without adequate food, winter clothing, or clear command structure, that units had been separated, communications had broken down, and many soldiers were simply trying to survive long enough to either reach their own lines or find some way to surrender without being shot. Washington retreated from his observation point with the same careful silence he had used to approach, circling around the clearing to position himself advantageously. He moved with careful precision, using every skill his grandfather had taught him during hunting trips that now seemed like memories from another lifetime, skills that involved reading terrain and using natural cover, moving silently through wilderness, understanding how to position yourself relative to targets, whether those targets were deer or desperate enemy soldiers. Those skills, dismissed as irrelevant by officers who saw him only as a supply clerk suitable for menial labor, now became his greatest advantage, the difference between having a plan and simply hoping for the best. He positioned himself behind a large oak tree approximately 40 yards from the clearing, checking his rifle to ensure no snow or ice had compromised its mechanism, chambering around with the distinctive metallic sound that any soldier would recognize, preparing himself mentally for what he was about to attempt. Then Private James Washington did something that defied all military logic and protocol, something that would seem like either incredible courage or incredible foolishness, depending on how the next few minutes unfolded. He stepped out from behind the tree, rifle raised but not aimed threateningly, held in a ready position that suggested capability without immediate hostility, and called out in his clearest voice, projecting with the authority he had heard from officers giving orders. The words were English, which he knew they would understand at least partially, given that military forces on both sides typically taught their soldiers basic language skills for dealing with enemies and prisoners. Stand up with your hands visible. You are surrounded by American forces. Surrender now and you will be treated fairly according to military convention and the agreements governing prisoner treatment. The 5 soldiers in the clearing spun toward his voice, their eyes wide with shock and confusion, hands reaching instinctively for weapons before training or survival instinct stopped them. They looked around the forest frantically, searching for the additional forces Washington had claimed surrounded them, trying to assess the situation even as their exhaustion and demoralization made clear thinking difficult. One of them, a sergeant based on his insignia, shouted back in heavily accented English, demanding to know how many soldiers were present, what unit they represented, what terms were being offered. Washington repeated his command, his voice steady despite his racing heart, despite the knowledge that he was alone and vulnerable, despite the certainty that if they called his bluff, he would have perhaps 3 seconds before being overwhelmed. The bluff was audacious, built on nothing but confidence, voice projection, and the hope that their exhaustion and demoralization would overcome their training and tactical sense. For 30 seconds that felt like eternity. The outcome balanced on a knife's edge so thin that the slightest miscalculation could have ended everything. Washington maintained his position, rifle ready, expression neutral, projecting a confidence he absolutely did not feel. The 5 soldiers exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them, weighing their options with the desperate calculation of men who had already decided that survival mattered more than pride or ideology. Then the sergeant slowly raised his hands, his rifle dangling from one hand by its strap, and spoke to his companions in German. His tone was resigned, almost relieved, the sound of someone who had been looking for an excuse to stop fighting and had finally been given one that allowed him to surrender without shame. One by one, the others followed his example, hands rising, weapons lowering, bodies relaxing in a way that suggested the decision brought more relief than fear. Washington emerged fully from his cover, maintaining his rifle position, his expression betraying none of the astonishment he felt, the overwhelming sense that what he had just accomplished should not have been possible. He gestured for them to move together, to place their weapons in a pile, communicating through gestures when words were insufficient. They complied with the shuffling movements of men who had already accepted defeat in their hearts long before this moment, who had been waiting for permission to stop fighting, to stop pretending they believed in victory, to acknowledge that they just wanted to go home alive. Their weapons made a small pile in the snow, 5 rifles, 2 pistols, a few grenades, the tools of combat that suddenly seemed less important than the possibility of warm food and shelter. Private Washington now faced a new problem that had not been part of his desperate plan. What to do with 5 prisoners when he was alone, lost in enemy-controlled forest, with limited ammunition and no way to communicate with friendly forces. The sergeant, whose name Washington learned was Joseph Kruger from a small town near Munich called Dachau, spoke enough English to facilitate basic communication, a skill that would prove invaluable in the hours ahead. Kruger explained that their unit, the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, had been separated during the offensive's early days, that they had been wandering for 2 days with minimal supplies, that they simply wanted to survive long enough to see home again, to return to families and lives that seemed impossibly distant given their current circumstances. His voice carried no hostility, no resentment, just the exhausted honesty of someone who had stopped maintaining the pretenses that military discipline normally demanded. Washington made a decision that would define everything that followed, a decision based partly on practical necessity and partly on instincts about human nature that he had developed growing up in a society that constantly required him to read situations and assess threats with precision that white Americans rarely needed. He told them the truth, or at least part of it, calculating that honesty might build a cooperation that would benefit everyone. He explained that he was separated from his unit, that they needed to move west to reach Allied lines, that cooperation offered their best chance of survival given the brutal conditions and the uncertain military situation. The Germans exchanged glances, processing this information with visible surprise, recognizing that their captor was in nearly as desperate a situation as they were, that this was not a powerful army unit extracting surrender, but a single soldier who had somehow convinced them they had no other choice. But Washington had established authority, had projected confidence and control, and they seemed willing to accept his leadership in exchange for the possibility of survival and eventual return home, rather than continuing to wander through frozen forest, hoping to stumble upon their own lines before freezing or starving. They moved through the forest together, a strange procession of captor and captives bound by mutual need rather than formal military protocol. Washington kept his rifle ready but not constantly aimed, a gesture that suggested trust while maintaining the possibility of enforcement, that acknowledged they were all human beings trying to survive rather than simply enemies defined by opposing uniforms. The Germans shared what little food they had, hard crackers and a small portion of sausage that was more ice than meat, barely enough to qualify as nutrition, but representing a gesture of goodwill. Washington reciprocated with contents from his emergency ration pack, the chocolate bars and concentrated biscuits that seemed like luxury compared to their meager supplies, watching as they ate with the desperate efficiency of truly hungry men. Kruger translated conversations, facilitating communication that went beyond simple military necessity, and Washington learned their stories with the careful attention of someone who understood that seeing enemies as individual humans might be important for maintaining control, or might simply be the decent thing to do regardless of practical considerations. Gunther from Hamburg, age 20, had worked as a baker before conscription, and he spoke wistfully about the smell of fresh bread in the early morning, about the particular techniques for achieving proper crust texture, about dreams of returning to that simple work if he survived. Friedrich from Berlin, age 19, a university student whose education had been interrupted mid-degree, talked about studying literature and philosophy, about books he had read and ideas he had discussed with professors who were now probably conscripted or dead. Klaus and Werner, brothers from a farming village near the Austrian border, aged 22 and 18 respectively, described agricultural work with the detailed knowledge of people who had spent their lives working land, who understood seasons and crops and the rhythms of rural life that now seemed like memories from someone else's existence. Washington listened to these stories while maintaining awareness of their surroundings, understanding that he was navigating multiple dangers simultaneously: the physical danger of exposure and enemy forces, the tactical danger of managing prisoners who might rebel despite their apparent resignation, and the deeper danger of sympathizing so much with enemy soldiers that he compromised his own judgment or safety. But he also understood, with an instinct born from a lifetime of navigating hostile social environments, that treating them with basic decency cost him nothing and might earn cooperation that force alone could never guarantee. His grandfather had once told him that power wielded with kindness was more sustainable than power wielded with cruelty, that people would follow someone who treated them fairly far more readily than someone who simply made them afraid. That wisdom, delivered in the context of navigating Jim Crow Georgia, now proved applicable in frozen Belgian forest, surrounded by enemy soldiers who had become his reluctant companions. That afternoon, moving carefully westward, while trying to avoid both enemy forces and any situation that might require combat, Washington's limited ammunition could not sustain. They encountered another group from the opposing forces. 8 soldiers emerged from the trees ahead, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of men conserving precious energy in brutal cold, their uniforms showing the same wear and exhaustion that characterized Kruger's group. Washington reacted instantly, years of hunting experience allowing him to process the situation and respond before conscious thought could interfere. He positioned his prisoners in front of him and called out with the same authoritative voice he had used before, that confident projection that suggested resources and backup he did not actually possess. The newcomers halted, confusion evident on their faces as they recognized Kruger and the others, trying to process why fellow soldiers were following an American and what that might mean about the military situation they found themselves in. Kruger, perhaps sensing an opportunity to improve his own circumstances or genuinely moved by Washington's relatively fair treatment, called out to them in German. What Kruger said Washington would learn later through Friedrich's translation was that they had been captured by a larger American force, that resistance was futile given Allied superiority in numbers and resources, that surrender meant warm food and medical treatment rather than continued suffering in the forest, with no clear path to safety or support. It was a combination of truth and strategic exaggeration, information presented in ways that suggested conclusions without outright lying, exactly the kind of tactical communication that effective leaders used regardless of formal training or official authority. And it worked, perhaps because the 8 soldiers were in no condition to question or resist, perhaps because Kruger's endorsement carried weight that Washington's claims alone might not have achieved. The 8 soldiers, after brief consultation among themselves, conducted in low voices Washington could not hear clearly, laid down their weapons in a small pile and raised their hands in the universal gesture of surrender. Washington now had 13 prisoners, a situation that was escalating from improbable to impossible, that challenged every assumption about what a single soldier could manage in hostile territory without support or communication. Yet something remarkable was happening, something that went beyond simple tactical achievement or lucky circumstances. The dynamic between him and these soldiers was shifting from captor-captive to something more complex and nuanced, a temporary alliance formed by shared hardship and the universal desire to survive conditions that cared nothing for nationality or ideology, or the abstract political conflicts that had brought them all to this forest. They were not enemies engaged in combat, but human beings trying to survive brutal winter weather, inadequate supplies, and a military situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's control or understanding. They spent the second night in an abandoned hunting cabin that Friedrich recognized from pre-conflict hiking trips in this region, when borders were more permeable and young men could travel for recreation rather than combat. The structure was small, barely large enough for 14 men, with gaps in the walls that let in freezing wind and no source of heat except a small fireplace that worked but had no fuel beyond what they could gather from the surrounding forest. But it offered shelter from the wind, that psychological comfort that mattered almost as much as physical warmth, and they crowded inside with a density that was uncomfortable, but provided shared body heat that increased everyone's chances of surviving another night. Washington maintained watch in shifts, though he noticed that several of the Germans volunteered to help, treating the arrangement more like a cooperative effort than enforced captivity. Understanding perhaps that their survival depended as much on Washington staying alert and functional as on their own efforts, they shared stories around a small fire built in the cabin's stone fireplace, feeding it carefully with branches broken from dead trees, the flames providing psychological comfort more than actual warmth, but still representing that ancient human response to cold and darkness. Klaus and Werner taught Washington a German folk song from their village, something about harvest time and community celebration, sung in low voices that would not carry far beyond the cabin's walls. Gunther described his bakery in excruciating detail, the particular recipe for dark rye bread that his grandfather had perfected over decades, the way flour felt between your fingers when it had the right moisture content, the smell of fresh loaves in the early morning when the ovens had just finished their work. Friedrich quoted poetry in German, then translated it imperfectly into English, trying to capture meanings that did not quite transfer between languages, talking about writers and thinkers, and ideas that had nothing to do with the conflict that had brought them all to this place. Washington shared his own stories carefully, aware that revealing too much might undermine the authority he needed to maintain or provide information that could be used against him if circumstances changed. He talked about growing up in Georgia, about hunting with his grandfather, about simple things like summer heat and the way evening thunderstorms would roll across the landscape, bringing temporary relief from humidity. He did not talk about segregation, about the daily humiliations of Jim Crow society, about the peculiar psychological burden of serving a nation that did not grant him full citizenship or equal treatment. Those realities were too complex to explain, too personal to share with enemy soldiers who had their own traumas and challenges, too likely to be misunderstood or dismissed or weaponized in ways he could not predict or control. Instead, he focused on universal human experiences, things that transcended nationality or ideology, the fundamental commonalities that existed despite every political system's efforts to emphasize difference and division. December 15th brought more encounters that followed patterns Washington was beginning to recognize. As they moved west, following his compass heading through forest that showed no signs of thinning or giving way to more open terrain that might contain friendly forces, they encountered 3 separate groups of soldiers from the opposing army. Each time, the pattern repeated with variations. Washington's authoritative commands, delivered with the confidence of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from projecting certainty. Kruger's translations and explanations that emphasized the futility of resistance and the benefits of surrender. The collective decision by exhausted men that surrender was preferable to continued wandering in hostile wilderness with no clear path to salvation or support. By midday, Washington was leading 27 prisoners, managing them with a combination of authority, cooperation, and the shared recognition that their interests aligned, despite official enemy status. By afternoon, the number had reached 30, this final group joining after seeing the orderly column of soldiers moving with apparent purpose and deciding that joining was preferable to remaining alone in forest that seemed to offer only death by freezing or starvation. The logistics of managing such a group would have been completely impossible if not for the voluntary cooperation of the prisoners themselves, who had become something more than captives but less than true allies, existing in that complicated space that emergency situations sometimes create. Kruger emerged as an unofficial lieutenant, helping organize the group, maintaining some semblance of order, translating Washington's instructions with additions and interpretations that helped maintain compliance without requiring constant enforcement. The soldiers arranged themselves in a loose formation, moving together with something approaching military discipline, despite their status as captives under the control of a single soldier, who had somehow convinced them this was their best option. They shared what little food anyone had, pooling resources in ways that extended survival possibilities for the entire group, helped weaker members who struggled with the cold or terrain or injuries sustained during earlier parts of the offensive, created a collective survival structure that benefited everyone. What Private Washington had created, perhaps without fully realizing it, was a temporary community, bound by circumstances beyond any individual's control. These were not enemies engaging in combat, but human beings trying to survive brutal winter in a forest that cared nothing for nationality or ideology or the political conflicts that had brought them to this place. Washington's authority derived not from force, but from the fact that he had a plan, a direction, a sense of purpose that gave meaning to their movement when aimless wandering would have meant certain death. The Germans followed because following offered hope, and hope was a commodity more valuable than ammunition or rations when survival itself seemed impossible. They followed because Washington treated them with basic dignity, because he shared his limited food despite having every justification for keeping it for himself, because he spoke to them as human beings rather than as inferior enemies deserving only contempt or cruelty. They followed because in the midst of chaos and violence and ideological warfare, he had somehow created a small pocket of humanity that everyone could recognize and respond to, regardless of training or propaganda or official enemy designations. Late on December 15th, after hours of careful navigation through forest that finally began showing signs of thinning, they heard the sounds of Allied positions, distant voices speaking English, the rumble of vehicles, the organized activity of established military presence, rather than scattered individuals trying to survive in wilderness. Washington called a halt and arranged his group carefully, understanding that approaching friendly lines with 30 enemy soldiers could easily result in everyone being shot before explanations could be offered or understood. He had Kruger explain to everyone that they were approaching friendly lines, that they needed to proceed slowly and visibly to avoid being fired upon, that everyone's survival now depended on following instructions precisely and not making any sudden movements that might be interpreted as hostile. The Germans formed into orderly rows, their hands clearly visible, their weapons already collected and carried by Kruger at Washington's direction, their posture and positioning designed to communicate surrender rather than threat in ways that any soldier would immediately recognize. Washington emerged from the forest first, moving slowly and deliberately, his rifle slung over his shoulder rather than held in ready position, his hands raised to show he was not an immediate threat despite being armed. American sentries spotted him instantly, weapons snapping to ready positions, shouts demanding identification and explanation for why a soldier was emerging from forest that was supposed to be controlled by enemy forces. Washington identified himself clearly. Private James Washington, 677th Transportation Company, separated from convoy during ambush on December 13th, attempting to return to Allied lines. The soldiers stared in disbelief as 30 men in enemy uniforms emerged from the trees behind him, arranged in neat formation, clearly under his control in ways that defied everything those sentries understood about combat operations and prisoner capture procedures. Within minutes, officers arrived to assess this impossible situation. Captain Marcus Thompson of the 28th Infantry Division approached with a mixture of confusion and suspicion, trying to process how a single supply clerk could have accomplished what seemed like either an elaborate trick or the most improbable tactical achievement of the entire offensive. Washington rendered a proper salute and made his report with the clarity and precision he had learned during military training. Separated from convoy during enemy ambush on December 13th, evaded immediate capture by retreating into forest, encountered and secured 30 prisoners while attempting to return to Allied lines, maintained control through combination of authority and cooperation, proceeding west using compass navigation until reaching established positions. Thompson listened to this account with visible skepticism, clearly struggling to process how this scenario could possibly be accurate, whether there was some element Washington was omitting or exaggerating, whether this whole situation represented a security risk that needed to be treated with extreme caution rather than as the straightforward prisoner delivery it appeared to be. The prisoners were taken into custody immediately, processed through standard procedures, and secured in a temporary holding area, while intelligence officers prepared to conduct detailed interrogations that might reveal useful information about enemy dispositions, intentions, or capabilities. Medical personnel checked them for injuries and exposure, finding several cases of frostbite requiring immediate treatment, but nothing life-threatening that prompt care could not address. All 30 survived their ordeal, would eventually be transferred to larger POW camps, would ultimately return to their homes in a defeated nation that would spend decades processing the moral and practical consequences of the conflict it had initiated. As they were led away under guard, Kruger turned back and caught Washington's eye, holding that contact for just a moment. He offered a small nod, a gesture of respect between men who had shared an extraordinary experience that transcended their official roles as enemies, that created a bond which neither fully understood, but both recognized as significant beyond normal military relationships. Captain Hendricks arrived at the forward position later that evening, having been notified through standard communication channels that one of his missing men had reappeared under unusual circumstances that required command attention. His initial response was relief that quickly transitioned to interrogation as he tried to understand exactly what had happened, how his supply clerk had managed to accomplish something that seemed more appropriate for combat infantry than logistics personnel. He questioned Washington extensively about every detail, the circumstances of each capture, the methods used to maintain control, the route taken through enemy-controlled forest, the interactions with prisoners, the decision-making process behind each action. Hendricks seemed almost disappointed that the story was exactly as Washington described. No elaborate tactics, No special operations training that Washington had somehow concealed, just a supply clerk who read situations correctly and responded with a combination of confidence, tactical bluffing, and basic human decency that happened to align with survival interests on both sides. The official report filed by Captain Thompson noted the successful capture and processing of 30 prisoners of war delivered to Allied custody by Private James Washington, 677th Transportation Company, following his separation from supply convoy and subsequent navigation through enemy-controlled territory. The report was factual, clinical, stripped of any drama or embellishment that might make the achievement seem more impressive than military bureaucracy preferred. It made no special mention of Washington's race, though that detail would become significant in subsequent coverage and in the broader context of how this story would be understood and transmitted. The Army, still operating under segregation policies that wouldn't be fully abolished until President Truman's executive order in 1948, had no framework for properly acknowledging achievements by African American soldiers that contradicted prevailing assumptions about their capabilities. That suggested perhaps the entire segregation system was built on foundations that had no relationship to actual human potential or merit. News of the incident spread through military channels with the organic efficiency of compelling stories that soldiers share when official communications fail to capture the strange realities of actual combat experience. Soldiers talked during mess hall meals. Stories were embellished and then corrected by those who had witnessed the actual event. And the tale of the supply clerk who walked out of the forest with 30 prisoners became something of a legend among troops in the region who desperately needed stories that suggested individual initiative and courage could still matter in a conflict increasingly dominated by industrial-scale violence and bureaucratic military structures. Journalists covering the conflict heard rumors through the informal networks they cultivated and requested interviews, recognizing that this story contained elements that would resonate with audiences back home, hungry for narratives of individual heroism that could be understood and celebrated. Washington, uncomfortable with attention that he had never sought, and preferring to return to his duties rather than become some kind of symbol or celebrity, declined most interview requests with the polite firmness of someone who understood that his achievement was being interpreted through frameworks he did not control and might not agree with. He gave one interview to a correspondent from Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper that served as a primary source of information for soldiers throughout all theaters of operation. In that interview, which he agreed to only after direct orders from Captain Hendricks, who recognized the propaganda value, even if he remained personally uncomfortable with the racial implications, Washington downplayed his actions with the instinctive modesty of someone raised in a culture that taught African American men to minimize their accomplishments, to avoid threatening white authority or inviting dangerous resentment. That interview contained a detail that would resonate far beyond military circles, that would be quoted and referenced in ways Washington could not have predicted when he spoke with characteristic honesty about his motivations and methods. When the correspondent asked how he had convinced so many men to surrender, Washington replied simply that he treated them the way he hoped to be treated, if situations were reversed, with basic respect and recognition of shared humanity, with the understanding that everyone in that forest was trying to survive circumstances beyond their control. The correspondent, a young writer from New York named David Klein, who had been covering the conflict with growing disillusionment about military propaganda and official narratives, noted this statement in his article, which ran under the headline "Supply Clerk Captures 30 in Ardennes Forest." Klein's article emphasized Washington's humanity, his tactical intelligence, his ability to read situations and respond appropriately, presenting the achievement as something simultaneously remarkable and fundamentally simple in its reliance on basic human decency rather than complex military training or special capabilities. The story was picked up by several newspapers back home, transmitted through wire services that recognized its appeal to audiences weary of abstract strategic reports and casualty statistics that had become numbingly routine. In African American communities throughout the nation, Washington's achievement took on additional significance that transcended the purely military dimensions of his story. The Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American, and other newspapers serving African-American readers ran prominent stories that presented Washington as proof of capabilities that segregationist narratives consistently denied. These stories appeared alongside ongoing coverage of the Double Victory campaign, that complex movement advocating for victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home, recognizing that the conflict's rhetoric about freedom and democracy rang hollow in a nation that maintained systematic racial oppression. Washington's story became a talking point in ongoing debates about military integration, about the waste of human potential inherent in segregation policies, about the contradiction between fighting a conflict ostensibly about human dignity, while maintaining a military structure that explicitly denied dignity to African American soldiers. Civil rights organizations used his example in advocacy materials, in speeches, in articles arguing for policy changes that military leadership resisted, with the same stubborn commitment to maintaining existing hierarchies that characterized most American institutions during this era. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People published a detailed analysis of African American military contributions that featured Washington's story prominently, using it to challenge assumptions about combat capability and leadership potential that segregation policies presumed, but that evidence increasingly contradicted. The formal military recognition, when it finally came, was modest in ways that reflected the institution's discomfort with achievements that challenged its organizing principles. Washington received a Bronze Star for meritorious achievement in ground operations against enemy forces, a decoration that acknowledged extraordinary performance, but stopped well short of the higher honors that similar achievements by white soldiers might have earned. The citation was standard bureaucratic language, acknowledging his actions, but framing them in the most clinical terms possible, stripped of any context or detail that might make the achievement seem more impressive or highlight the racial dimensions that made it particularly significant. Captain Hendricks pinned the medal to Washington's uniform during a brief ceremony at the unit's bivouac area, a perfunctory event attended by Washington's immediate unit members, but lacking any special attention or recognition from higher command levels that might have been expected given the unusual nature of his achievement. There were no speeches beyond the reading of the official citation, no special attention from senior officers who might have used the occasion for broader statements about courage or capability, just a quick acknowledgement that fulfilled minimum requirements before everyone returned to their regular duties and the normal rhythms of military life. The ceremony's brevity and lack of fanfare spoke volumes about how the military viewed achievements by African American soldiers, even when those achievements could not be ignored or dismissed, worth acknowledging through official channels because complete silence would have been impossible to justify, but not worth celebrating in ways that might suggest these men deserved treatment equal to white soldiers who performed similar feats. But the impact of Washington's achievement extended far beyond official recognition or the lack thereof, manifesting in subtle but meaningful changes in how his fellow soldiers treated him and how officers from other units responded when they encountered him. Men in the 677th Transportation Company began treating Washington differently, with a respect that had been conspicuously absent before, addressing him with tones that acknowledged his proven capabilities rather than assuming incompetence based on his race. Officers from other units, including some who would never have spoken to a black supply clerk under normal circumstances, made a point of seeking him out, asking questions about his experience, treating him as someone whose perspective had value beyond his official rank or assigned duties. The change was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood the normal social dynamics of a segregated military. Washington had proven something that many had assumed impossible, and that proof carried weight that no amount of argument or advocacy could have achieved. The 30 prisoners Washington had captured were eventually transferred to larger prisoner-of-war camps operated by Allied forces, facilities where they joined thousands of others, awaiting the conflict's conclusion and eventual repatriation to a homeland that would be transformed by total defeat. Several of them, including Joseph Kruger, would later describe their experience in interviews, conducted by military historians compiling comprehensive records of the conflict's various aspects. Kruger's account, given to American military researchers in 1946 as part of a systematic effort to understand prisoner psychology and surrender dynamics, emphasized Washington's calm authority and fair treatment with a directness that suggested genuine respect rather than mere politeness or strategic answering designed to please interrogators. Kruger noted in his testimony that Washington never displayed hostility or contempt. Despite having every justification for both, never took advantage of his position of power to humiliate or abuse prisoners who were completely vulnerable, and maintained a professional demeanor that earned genuine respect rather than mere compliance born of fear or necessity. These observations, documented in official military archives and later made available to researchers studying the conflict's various aspects, provided evidence that effective prisoner handling depended more on psychology and basic human decency than on force or intimidation, that demoralized soldiers would respond to confident authority that treated them fairly regardless of numerical superiority or obvious power advantages. The broader implications of Washington's achievement emerged gradually as military analysts and historians studied the incident in the context of larger patterns about leadership, prisoner operations, and the psychology of surrender that characterized this conflict's various theaters. Analysts noted that successful prisoner capture often depended more on psychological factors than physical force, that exhausted and demoralized soldiers would respond to confident authority regardless of the captor's actual resources or backup support, that treating prisoners with basic decency often generated cooperation that purely coercive approaches could never achieve. Washington's instinctive understanding of these principles, combined with his ability to project calm control despite his own desperate circumstances, demonstrated leadership qualities that had been completely overlooked during his military service up to that point. Qualities that the segregated military structure was specifically designed to prevent from being recognized or developed in African American soldiers. The Ardennes offensive, which had seemed like such a catastrophic surprise when it began on December 16th, ultimately failed in its strategic objectives despite initial tactical successes that briefly threatened Allied positions and forced hasty defensive responses. The opposing forces lacked the fuel supplies necessary to sustain mechanized advance, lacked the replacement troops needed to exploit initial breakthroughs, lacked the air support that Allied bombing campaigns had systematically destroyed over preceding months, and ultimately lacked the industrial capacity to compete with Allied production advantages that would have been decisive even if tactical execution had been flawless. By late January 1945, Allied forces had pushed back all territorial gains the offensive had achieved, had resumed their advance toward the Rhine River and the territory beyond, and had inflicted casualties on enemy forces that could not be replaced given the total mobilization that had already exhausted available manpower reserves. The conflict in Western Europe would conclude in May 1945 with total surrender, following the capture of Berlin and the complete collapse of organized resistance. The broader global conflict would end with Japan's surrender in August of that same year, after atomic weapons demonstrated a level of destructive capability that made continued resistance seem pointless even to the most committed ideologues. Washington continued his service through the conflict's conclusion, returning to supply duties, but with a significantly different status among his peers and superiors, who could no longer maintain the comfortable fiction that he and soldiers like him were capable only of menial labor and support roles that required no intelligence, initiative, or courage. After discharge in late 1945, processed through demobilization centers, alongside millions of other soldiers returning to civilian life and uncertain futures, Washington returned to Georgia, where he found a society largely unchanged, despite the massive global conflict that was supposed to have been fought for freedom and democracy. He used military benefits provided through the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, commonly known as the GI Bill, to attend Morehouse College in Atlanta, one of the nation's premier historically black institutions of higher education. The GI Bill, though theoretically available to all veterans regardless of race, was administered in ways that systematically disadvantaged African American veterans through local and state policies that maintained segregation and limited access to quality education. But Washington persevered through obstacles that would have defeated less determined individuals, earning a degree in education that qualified him for professional work in a society that still sharply limited opportunities available to black professionals. He spent 32 years teaching history in segregated and later gradually integrated public schools in Georgia, educating thousands of students through decades that saw massive social changes as the civil rights movement challenged and eventually dismantled many, though not all, aspects of the formal segregation system. Washington rarely spoke about his military service during these years, treating it as one chapter among many in a life that was notable for its steady dedication to education and community service, rather than for any single dramatic achievement. When students or colleagues asked about the Bronze Star that he kept in a drawer at home rather than displaying prominently, he would deflect with brief answers that emphasized luck and circumstance rather than personal courage or capability, maintaining throughout his life that characteristic modesty that prevented him from seeking or accepting recognition he felt was undeserved or excessive. The story of what Washington accomplished in that Belgian forest became part of military history, cited in studies of leadership development, prisoner operations, combat psychology, and the various factors that influenced surrender decisions during this conflict's numerous theaters and phases. Military academies used his example in instruction about tactical decision-making under uncertainty, about the importance of projecting authority even when resources were limited, about understanding enemy psychology and exploiting demoralization effectively. But the story also became something more significant in the ongoing American conversation about race, capability, and the systematic underestimation of human potential based on superficial categorization and inherited prejudice that had no relationship to actual merit or demonstrated ability. Washington had been dismissed, overlooked, and relegated to roles that kept him invisible and powerless, precisely because of assumptions that had nothing to do with his actual abilities or potential contributions. Officers who commanded him had assumed incompetence based on his race, had structured his assignments to prevent him from demonstrating capabilities that might challenge their comfortable prejudices, had created an entire institutional system designed to confirm pre-existing beliefs rather than discover and develop talent wherever it existed. When circumstances removed those artificial constraints, when Washington was forced to rely on his own judgment and capabilities without the interference of others' low expectations or institutional barriers, he achieved something that defied all predictions and challenged fundamental assumptions about who was capable of effective leadership and tactical excellence. The 30 men who emerged from that forest with him represented more than a tactical success or an impressive personal achievement measured in purely military terms. They represented evidence that capability exists, independent of recognition, that courage manifests in forms that don't always fit comfortable narratives or official categories, that the potential for extraordinary action lives in people whom systems of prejudice have systematically undervalued and dismissed. Washington never claimed to be a hero in the conventional sense that military cultures typically celebrate, never sought special recognition beyond what was his due, never demanded acknowledgement that others were reluctant to provide. He simply did what the situation required, using skills and judgment that had always been present but had never been given opportunity for expression or development in a military system designed to prevent exactly that kind of achievement from occurring. The military's eventual integration, formalized by President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in 1948, but not fully implemented until the early 1950s, was driven by multiple intersecting factors. Moral arguments about equality provided ethical pressure. Strategic recognition that segregation weakened military effectiveness provided practical justification. International pressure from allies who viewed American segregation as hypocrisy provided geopolitical motivation, and perhaps most importantly, the accumulated evidence from thousands of individual examples like Washington's that contradicted assumptions underlying segregation policies provided empirical proof that the entire system was built on false premises. Washington's story became one data point among many that collectively overwhelmed institutional resistance to change. One example in a larger pattern that eventually made continuing segregation seem both morally indefensible and practically wasteful. Civil rights advocates used his achievement, and others like it, to argue that segregation prevented the military from accessing the full range of available talent, that artificial barriers based on race meant capable soldiers were relegated to menial roles, while less capable white soldiers received positions of authority and responsibility, that the entire system optimized for maintaining racial hierarchy rather than military effectiveness. These arguments, supported by mounting evidence from actual combat experience, eventually convinced enough decision-makers that integration represented necessary reform rather than dangerous social experimentation. Josef Kruger, the German sergeant who became Washington's unwitting ally in the forest through circumstances neither man could have predicted or desired, returned to Munich after the conflict's end and the long process of denazification, repatriation, and social reconstruction that transformed his homeland. He rebuilt his life in a nation that had been physically devastated and morally traumatized by total defeat and the revelation of crimes committed in its name. Working as a translator and eventually as a teacher of English to German students, navigating a transformed world where their language of commerce and diplomacy had shifted from German to English as American influence replaced previous European power structures. In 1973, nearly 3 decades after their encounter in the Ardennes, Kruger wrote a letter to the United States Army requesting help in locating James Washington, explaining that he wished to reconnect with the man who had captured him and treated him with unexpected decency during one of the darkest periods of his life. The Army, with cooperation from veterans organizations that maintained extensive databases and networks connecting former service members, facilitated contact between the two men. Kruger and Washington exchanged several letters over the following years, maintaining a correspondence that reflected the strange bond formed in extraordinary circumstances that transcended normal categories of enemy and captor. Their letters, written in English since Kruger had maintained his language skills, while Washington had never learned German, beyond the few phrases he picked up during those days in the forest, discussed ordinary life events, family developments, philosophical reflections on the conflict they had both experienced from such different perspectives, and the peculiar intimacy that sometimes develops between people who shared extreme experiences, even if they were nominally on opposite sides. In one letter, preserved now in the archives of the National Museum of African American History and Culture as part of a larger collection documenting African American military service, Kruger described the moment when he decided to surrender to Washington. He explained with the careful honesty of someone trying to convey something subtle and important, that he had seen something in the young American's eyes, a combination of determination and decency that suggested this was a person who would keep his word, who could be trusted even in circumstances where trust seemed impossibly naive. Kruger wrote that Washington's voice carried an authority that came not from aggression or threats, but from genuine confidence, from the certainty of someone who knew his course of action was right, even if circumstances suggested it should have been impossible. That quality, Kruger suggested, was what made 30 exhausted soldiers willing to follow him through a frozen forest toward an uncertain future, was what created trust where military logic suggested only suspicion should exist. Washington's response to that letter, also preserved in the same archive collection, was characteristically modest in ways that defined his entire approach to his military service and its significance. He wrote that he had simply done what seemed necessary given the circumstances, that he had treated the German soldiers the way any decent person would treat others in distress, regardless of official enemy status or the abstract political conflicts that military structures emphasized. He added that the experience had taught him that people everywhere wanted fundamentally the same things: safety from immediate threats, dignity in how they were treated, the chance to return home to loved ones and communities, the opportunity to live lives of meaning and purpose rather than being consumed by conflicts they had not chosen and frequently did not fully understand. These observations, expressed in simple language without any philosophical pretension or attempt at profound significance, captured something essential about Washington's character and the reasons why his achievement resonated beyond its immediate military context. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.